I never asked for an alien princess. Hell, I never even asked to be stationed on the fringes of the galactic frontier. But the universe has a way of throwing curveballs, and this one came wrapped in royal silks and a whole lot of diplomatic baggage. Her name was Zalara, a princess of the Cathari Dominion, an empire that had ruled vast stretches of space long before humans ever left Earth. She was their king's daughter, a product of one of his many consorts, and by all rights she should have been someone important. But she wasn't, because to the Cathari she was useless. Cathari society valued strength, both physical and genetic. Their ruling elite were expected to breed, passing down their warrior heritage to the next generation. But Zalara was infertile, a defect, a disgrace, an embarrassment her father sought to erase without outright killing her. That's where we came in. The official word from the Dominion was that Zalara was a gift to humanity, a gesture of goodwill to strengthen relations between our people. That was a load of diplomatic bullshit. The truth was, the Cathari wanted to get rid of her, and they figured the best way to do that was to dump her on the nearest species that was making waves in the galactic arena. Us. I was the unlucky bastard chosen to receive her. They brought her aboard the UHS Valiant under heavy guard, even though she didn't resist. The Cathari warriors, flanking her, carried themselves with that same arrogant posture I'd seen before, the kind that said they believed they were superior in every way. They barely acknowledged me as I stood at the base of the ramp, hands behind my back, watching as their gift descended toward me. She was taller than I expected, with the feline grace that all Cathari possessed. Her golden eyes flickered with something unreadable as she met my gaze, and for a moment, I thought, I saw a spark of defiance there. Then it was gone, replaced with something colder. One of the Cathari warriors stepped forward and handed me a tablet. His dark fur bristled slightly, as if the very act of interacting with me was beneath him. By decree of His Excellency, King Vorak of the Cathari Dominion, the human known as Captain Elias Carter, shall take custody of the royal daughter Zalara as a sign of our people's commitment to peaceful relations, the warrior recited stiffly. I took the tablet without looking at it. That's a nice way of saying you're dumping her on us because she's an inconvenience. A few of the Cathari bristled at that, but they said nothing. They didn't have to. We all knew what this was. Zalara turned her head slightly, her gaze sharpening as she studied me. Her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly soft, but edged with steel. I do not require pity, human. Good, I said, slipping the tablet into my belt, because you're not getting any. I gestured for her to follow, and she did, walking beside me with her chin held high. The Cathari didn't say a word as we boarded the ship, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. Maybe they expected us to mistreat her, to treat her like some discarded thing, but that wasn't the human way. The doors sealed shut behind us, and I turned to face her fully for the first time, my arms crossed. You have any idea why they sent you here? I asked. Zalara tilted her head, considering me. I am an inconvenience to my father, a failure. He wishes me forgotten. I nodded slowly. Well, Princess, I don't do forgotten. Her eyes narrowed slightly at that, as if she wasn't sure what to make of me. I wasn't sure what to make of her either, but I had a feeling the Cathari had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Zalara wasn't what I expected. When someone says, alien princess, you imagine something regal, maybe even delicate. But the woman standing in front of me was nothing like that. She was tall, with the lithe, predatory build common among the Cathari. Her dark blue-grey skin patterned with lighter streaks that almost resembled tiger stripes. Her golden eyes were sharp, scanning everything around her like she was mapping an escape route. Not that she was shackled. I had made sure of that the moment she stepped aboard. The Cathari guards had brought her to us in gilded restraints, a humiliating display of her status as a cast-off. The first thing I did was remove them. She had watched me with an unreadable expression as I tossed them aside, but she said nothing. Now, in the dim lighting of the officers' quarters, she stood in the center of the room, her posture too rigid. For someone who was supposed to be free, she didn't sit, didn't relax, just stood there with that same tense energy, like a caged animal who didn't know whether to fight or flee. "You can sit, you know," I said, leaning back against my desk. She didn't move. "Why?" I raised an eyebrow. "Because you look like you're expecting to be thrown in a cell, and that's not happening." She studied me for a long moment before finally lowering herself into the chair opposite me. Even then, her back was straight, hands resting carefully on her knees. "You do not treat me like a prisoner," she said slowly, like she was testing the words. "Because you're not one," I replied. "Not on my ship." Her golden eyes flickered with something. Confusion, maybe. Suspicion. "Your people did not ask for me," she said. "You were given no choice in accepting this arrangement." I sighed. "Yeah. Well, that makes two of us." Something shifted in her expression. Just a little, but it was there. A flicker of understanding. A silent acknowledgement that neither of us had any control over how we ended up in this situation. Still, there was a gap between us, one built from years of cultural divide. The Cathari didn't think much of humans. They saw us as young, reckless, unproven, a species that had risen too fast, too aggressively. Even as we carved a place for ourselves among the stars, the older empires regarded us with thinly veiled disdain, and yet despite all their arrogance, they had just handed us one of their own. "How much do you know about humans?" I asked. Zalara tilted her head slightly. "Enough. Enough to know we don't exactly throw away people just because they can't breed." Her jaw tightened, and I knew I had hit a nerve. "Cathari society is built on lineage," she said, voice carefully measured. "A royal without heirs has no purpose." "Sounds like bullshit to me." Her gaze snapped to mine, startled. "I didn't sugarcoat things, and I wasn't about to start now. You were thrown away because of something you can't control," I said. "And now you're here. Question is, what do you want to do about it?" Zalara went very still. Not in fear, but in thought, like no one had ever asked her that before. Finally, she exhaled a slow, measured breath. "I do not know," she admitted. "I was never given a choice." "Well, you have one now." I leaned forward. "You're not property, Zalara. Not to the Cathari, not to me, not to anyone. You decide where this goes." For the first time since she arrived, she looked uncertain, like the weight of that decision was heavier than the chains she had worn. She had spent her whole life being told what she was. A princess, a failure, a discarded relic. But what if she could be something more? The question hung between us, unspoken but real, and for the first time I saw the slightest hint of something in her eyes. Not defiance, not resignation. Hope. The Cathari were warriors. Ruthless, disciplined, and locked into traditions so rigid they might as well have been stone. Their empire had stood for thousands of years, and they liked to remind everyone of that fact. To them, humanity was nothing more than a young, reckless species, expanding too fast, making too many enemies. We didn't follow the rules of the older empires. We didn't wait our turn. We adapted, we innovated, and worst of all, in their eyes, we won. That was why they hated us, and that was why they had made a mistake. Zalara wasn't useless. She wasn't broken. She wasn't even infertile in the ways that truly mattered. The Cathari valued bloodlines, but humanity valued something else entirely: knowledge, strategy, the ability to learn and evolve. And Zalara had knowledge in spades. The first time I asked her for help, she hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she didn't understand why I wanted it. "You wish me to teach you Cathari war doctrine?" she asked, standing across from me in the ship's war room. A holographic projection of a Cathari fleet hovered between us, blue light casting sharp shadows on her features. "You sound surprised," she frowned slightly, golden eyes flicking over the fleet formation. "I was discarded, useless. Why would you value the knowledge of someone unworthy?" I crossed my arms. "You were unworthy to them, not to me." She studied me for a long moment, and I could see the gears turning in her head. Slowly, she turned her attention back to the display, her expression shifting from hesitation to focus. "The Cathari are bound by tradition," she said, gesturing toward the fleet. "Their formations have remained unchanged for centuries. They favor overwhelming force, believing that superior numbers and firepower ensure victory." I smirked. "Sounds predictable." "It is," she admitted. "But it has worked for them. No species has been able to counter their battle doctrine effectively." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "No species before humans." Zalara blinked at me, something unreadable flickering across her face. A realization, maybe, or the beginning of something more. We spent the next few weeks testing what she knew. She taught my officers Cathari combat techniques, drilling them in hand-to-hand combat that had been honed over centuries. She showed us how Cathari officers thought, how they reacted under pressure, how their entire strategy was built around brute force rather than adaptability, and we tore it apart piece by piece. One night, I found her in the training hall, watching. Two of my men sparring. They moved fast, adapting Cathari techniques into something more fluid, more unpredictable. "They are learning quickly," she murmured. I stepped beside her. "Humans do that." She glanced at me, something like amusement in her eyes. "It is strange." "What is?" She hesitated before answering. "To be valued for what I know, rather than what I can produce." I didn't reply right away. I let her words hang there, let her sit with them. Then finally I said, "You were never useless, Zalara. Your people just didn't know what they had." She looked away, but not before I caught the smallest, briefest smile tugging at the corner of her lips. The Cathari had cast her aside. But humans, we never waste potential. It started small. At first, Zalara only observed, offering occasional insights during our training sessions. She would stand at the edges of the combat hall, arms crossed, golden eyes scanning every movement, every mistake. She didn't correct often, but when she did, my soldiers listened. Then came the battle simulations. The UHS Valiant was equipped with an advanced tactical AI capable of running real-time fleet engagements. We fed it everything Zalara knew about. Cathari battle doctrine, their strategies, their weaknesses. She stood beside me in the war room, her hands clasped behind her back as she watched the simulation unfold. "This is how a Cathari fleet engages a lesser enemy," she explained, nodding toward the shifting holograms. "They prioritize immediate dominance, seeking to overwhelm before the battle can become prolonged." I watched the display closely. The Cathari ships moved in rigid formations, their firepower coordinated, their movements predictable. My simulated fleet fought back, but it was clear that, without intervention, we would be crushed. I turned to Zalara. "How do we break them?" She hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because this was the moment where she had to choose. Her father had sent her away like she was garbage, an inconvenience. And now she stood on the bridge of a human warship, deciding whether or not to turn the knowledge of her own people against them. Then her gaze hardened. "Their structure is rigid," she said, stepping closer to the display. "They rely on superior numbers and overwhelming force, but they lack adaptability. They do not react well to unpredictability." I grinned. "Good thing humans thrive on unpredictability." She nodded, reaching out to manipulate the holographic display. "If you feint a retreat here," she dragged one of my fleet's markers back, "creating a gap in our formation, they will assume you are weakening. They will overextend, seeking to break your defenses quickly. And that's when we hit them where it hurts, I finished, watching as she shifted another group of ships into position for a counterattack. The simulation ran again. This time, with Zalara's adjustments, we didn't just hold our ground. We destroyed them. The Cathari formation crumbled under our feigned retreat, their lead ships overcommitted and surrounded. Zalara stared at the outcome, lips slightly parted. Not in shock, but in something closer to realization. "It works," she murmured. I clapped a hand on her shoulder. "Damn right it does." From that moment on, there was no hesitation. Zalara threw herself into training my crew, teaching them Cathari, close combat techniques, showing my officers how to read Cathari fleet movements before they happened. She worked side by side with our tactical team, developing counter-strategies for engagements we hadn't even fought yet. And when the first real battle came, we were ready. The Dominion had been watching us. They didn't like how quickly humanity was growing in strength. They didn't like how, in every small skirmish, we were proving harder and harder to break. So they sent a fleet. A small one at first, a warning shot across the bow. They didn't expect us to win. Zalara stood beside me on the bridge as our ships engaged the enemy. She was calm, poised, and when the Cathari admiral made the exact mistake she predicted, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "They underestimated us," she said quietly. I grinned. "They won't make that mistake again." She turned to me, golden eyes gleaming. "No, they won't." The Cathari called her barren, but she had just given birth to something new. Humanity's first real victory against their empire, and it was only the beginning. The aftermath of battle was always the same. The smell of scorched metal, the hum of the ship's systems working overtime to compensate for the stress of combat. The quiet murmurs of the crew as they processed the fact that they were still alive. Victory was never clean, never easy, but this one felt different. We had just beaten the Cathari at their own game. Zalara stood at the edge of the bridge, staring at the tactical display as the remnants of the enemy fleet retreated. Her expression was unreadable, but I knew what she was thinking. She had spent her entire life under the shadow of a people who had deemed her worthless. Now, she had helped us outmaneuver one of the most feared warrior empires in the galaxy. "Status report," I called out. "Minor hull damage," my second-in-command, Lieutenant Vega, responded. "Shields held up better than expected. No casualties. A damn miracle." The Cathari didn't fight half-heartedly, and yet we had managed to get through it without losing a single soul. That wasn't luck. That was strategy. Her strategy. Zalara finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "They will not take this defeat lightly." I nodded, crossing my arms as I studied the wreckage on the display. "No, they won't. The Cathari Dominion didn't tolerate failure. The admiral who led this attack would either be executed or sent on a suicide mission to redeem himself. Either way, they'd be back, and next time they'd bring a much bigger force." "What do you think they'll do next?" I asked, glancing at Zalara. She didn't answer right away. She was still processing, still adjusting to the reality of what she had done. But when she finally spoke, there was no hesitation. "They will escalate," she said. "My father does not accept defeat. He will send more ships, more warriors. He will want to make an example of you." I smirked. "Let him try." Zalara turned to face me fully, something unreadable in her expression. "You do not fear him." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "No. Should I?" She considered that for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, she let out a soft, breathy laugh. It was short, barely there, but it was real. "You are unlike any leader I have known," she admitted. "Good," I said. "Because we're not fighting this war the way your people expect us to." She inclined her head slightly, something almost like respect in her gaze. I could see it now. "The shift happening inside her, the way she stood straighter, the way her voice no longer carried the weight of someone expecting to be dismissed. She was no longer just an outcast, a discarded royal. She was our strategist now, and the Dominion was about to find out just how dangerous that made her. Hours later, I found her alone in one of the observation decks. The vastness of space stretched out before her, stars reflecting in her golden eyes. "You should get some rest," I said, stepping up beside her. "I cannot," she admitted. "There is too much to think about." I leaned against the railing. "Regretting it," she turned her head slightly, frowning. "Regretting what?" "Helping us," I said. "Turning against your own people." She exhaled, slow and measured. "They turned against me first." There was no bitterness in her voice, just fact. A quiet, undeniable truth. "Then maybe it's time they learned what they threw away," I said. For a long time she didn't respond. But then, finally, she nodded. "Yes," she murmured. "Perhaps it is." The message came 3 days later. We had been preparing, running drills, analyzing every possible counter to the Cathari's next move. Zalara was relentless, working with my officers from dawn to dusk, fine-tuning strategies, breaking down weaknesses in Cathari battle formations. She never seemed to tire. If anything, she was more focused than ever, as if proving herself wasn't enough. She wanted to win. But when the transmission came through, everything stopped. I stood on the bridge as the encrypted message flashed. Across the hollow display, the Cathari sigil spinning in crimson light. It was official, royal, a direct communication from the throne itself. Zalara stood beside me, arms folded, her expression carefully neutral. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers flexed slightly, as if resisting the urge to clench into fists. "Play it," I said. The screen flickered and a towering figure filled the display, King Varkath, ruler of the Cathari Dominion. His presence was as imposing as ever, broad-shouldered, draped in ceremonial armor, his deep blue skin marked with intricate silver tattoos denoting his lineage. His golden eyes burned with something cold and furious. "Commander Kane of the Valiant," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "You have taken something that belongs to the Dominion." I glanced at Zalara. She didn't flinch. "Your daughter is not a prisoner," I said, keeping my tone even. "She was given to us, if I recall correctly." Varkath's expression didn't change. But I saw the twitch of his jaw, the flicker of rage barely contained. "She was given as a symbol of peace," he said, "not as a tool for your war games." I folded my arms. "She isn't a tool. She's a strategist, and she's damn good at it." His eyes flicked to Zalara then, and for the first time something like disdain crossed his face. "You disgrace your bloodline." Zalara didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was calm, steady. "You threw me away." "You were given a purpose," Varkath shot back. "A chance to bring stability to the Dominion's relations with humanity. Instead, you have betrayed your own kind." I could feel the tension radiating from her, but she didn't break. "You speak of betrayal," she said, tilting her head slightly. "And yet, when was the last time the Dominion fought for me? When was the last time I was more than a liability to you?" Varkath's expression darkened. "You are Cathari. Your duty, my duty, was to be cast aside the moment I failed to produce an heir," she cut in. "That is what I was to you, a failed bloodline, a waste of royal lineage, but humans do not see me that way." I felt a spark of pride at that. She wasn't just defending herself, she was making a stand, declaring, in front of the most powerful figure in the Dominion, that she mattered. Varkath exhaled sharply, the controlled anger of a ruler who wasn't used to being defied. "You will return to the Dominion immediately. This is not a request." Zalara's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And if I refuse, Silence. Then Varkath turned his gaze back to me, and there was no mistaking the threat in his voice. If she does not return, humanity will burn for your defiance. The transmission cut off. The bridge was quiet, every officer frozen, waiting for my response. I turned to Zalara. "So," I said, "what do you want to do?" She met my gaze, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked certain. "I want to fight," I grinned. "Then let's make the Dominion regret ever letting you go." The war came faster than expected. Varkath didn't waste time with politics or ultimatums. Less than a week after his transmission, Dominion forces began to mobilize. Scouts reported Cathari fleets gathering at the borders, their movements too deliberate to be anything but preparation for war. The Dominion had always been slow to change, slow to adapt, but they were still an empire forged in blood, and when they chose to strike, they did so without mercy. We had taken their princess. Now they wanted to take everything from us. Zalara stood beside me on the bridge of the Valiant, golden eyes fixed on the tactical display as enemy ships poured into human-controlled space. She had spent the last week working around the clock, analyzing every potential move, every possible response. Now, the moment had arrived. "This is not a show of strength," she murmured. "This is extermination." I nodded. "They don't just want you back. They want to make sure humanity never defies them again." Her expression remained unreadable, but I knew her well enough by now to see what was beneath the surface. This wasn't just a battle for her. It was proof. Proof that she wasn't broken. Proof that she wasn't some useless exile. Proof that her father had made the worst mistake of his life by casting her aside. "We won't let them win," I said. She turned to me then, and for the first time there was no hesitation in her voice. "No, we won't." The battle began. The Dominion struck first, their fleets moving with the overwhelming force that had crushed dozens of civilizations before us. The Cathari didn't believe in drawn-out warfare. They fought to end things, to make sure their enemies never had the chance to rise again. Their ships swarmed into our territory like a tidal wave, bristling with firepower, their formations tight and unyielding. But this time, they were fighting against something they didn't understand. Us Zalara's strategies were brutal, precise. She predicted their movements before they made them, exploiting their rigidity, forcing them into engagements they weren't prepared for. Every time the Cathari pushed forward, we gave them just enough ground to make them believe they were winning. Then we hit back twice as hard, cutting off their supply lines, disrupting their formations, turning their own momentum against them. They had expected a slaughter. Instead, they found themselves bleeding. On the third day of battle, the Valiant led a counter-offensive that shattered an entire Dominion fleet. The moment we broke their line, Zalara acted without hesitation, ordering a strike that severed their command structure, leaving the remaining ships in disarray. And just like that, the unstoppable Cathari war machine did something unthinkable. It faltered. On the bridge, my crew erupted in cheers as enemy ships began their retreat. I let them celebrate, but my attention was on Zalara. She stood at the center of it all, watching as the Dominion forces fled, her expression unreadable. "You did it," I said. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had held inside for far too long. "We did it," she corrected. And she was right. This wasn't just her victory, it was ours. Humanity had taken on the Dominion and survived. No, more than that, we had won. Varkath wouldn't accept this. Not yet. But he had learned something today. His daughter was not a failure. She was the beginning of something new. Something the Cathari had never seen before, and no matter how much he raged, no matter how many fleets he sent, there was no taking her back now.